of pulmonary pathophysiology during the most severe state, just to deal with the contradiction that we find sometimes between experimental work and the clinical daily activity. Because I think that the most of the problem that we deal have to do with the lung dishomogeneity, which is not a very strange concept. But I would like to present you some quantitative approach to this to tell you which are the possible clinical consequences. Everybody knows which is the actual dogma, 6 ml per kilo tidal volume ventilation. And there is no question that the tidal volume is an important contributor to a possible lung deterioration. Using the excessive tidal volume either with mechanical ventilation or even in spontaneous breathing animal, as an example, as Kolobov did 30 years ago, just putting aspirin in the cisterna magna, the sheep, spontaneous breathing, with this big tidal volume in 24 hours developed a syndrome very similar to the RDS. That means a complete and diffuse lung edema. To the tidal volume, the other side of the coin is the pressure. In an elastic structure, we cannot change the pressure without changing the volume and vice versa. And the tidal volume plateau of 30 is where come from? Basically come from an editorial that Mark Tobin wrote associated to the RDS neck paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. There are not really scientific proof of this magic number, but has been accepted because it's reasonable and is very close to the tidal, to the plateau pressure at which the lung expansion is close to the total lung capacity, enters in this region. And then we have this PEEP, this magic number, that if you take the experimental literature and in animals you apply PEEP 0 or PEEP 10 or 15, you find extraordinary differences and extraordinary results. When you go to the RDS patient, it's very hard to find something really serious, as with the tidal volume. That means that the signal, due to a continuous expansion of the lung, as provided by people, is more fragile, is more important than the signal provided by the continuous tidal stretching. Remember, PEEP is a continuous application of force. Tidal volume is up and down. Tidal volume is associated with movement, is associated with energy dissipation. When I provide PEEP, I don't charge any energy into the system. Just after the first movement, when I distend the lung, but then the movement due to PEEP is 0. Just have to think this, because these are the reality that we'll deal. Try to forget what you read in the papers or we repeat at the conferences, and to look at the reality with the eyes of a baby. Just forget everything and just look and use the common sense to explore. Homogeneous, what is homogeneity? If you take the first chapter in the Handbook of Physiology in the 60s, when less computer but more brain, I think, there is some definition where homogeneity is some material which has the same characteristics in each of its components, in each the space occupied by this material has the same characteristics. In each direction, when I disturb the material, the challenge is propagated evenly in all the material. Of course, the lung is not homogeneous because we have the lung parenchyma, but we have the bronchi, we have the vessels, different diameters, different, so and so. From the macrostructure to the microstructure. But we can try to assess, to quantify what is the dishomogeneity, what is some measurement of dishomogeneity in normal condition, and then to refer and to compare with the patient with the lung failure, ARDS, diffuse edema. It took a couple of 2 or 3 years to develop this kind of program. I try to explain in the most simple way they can. Imagine that you take one piece of the lung, this one region, which are called region of interest, ROI, which may be as small as a voxel, or maybe 10 voxel, or 100 voxel, whatever you want, okay? Now let's say I take a region of the dimension of the acinus. The acinus is about 16 millimeters cubic square of the millimeters, not square, at the third power, okay? And I take this region. Let's say I measure the inflation with the CT scan. And I found that 70% in this region is gas, okay? If the neighbors material are homogeneous, I should find an inflation of 0.7. So if I divide the inflation fraction of the neighbor regions for the inflation fraction of the region I'm looking to, the perfect homogeneity will give me the results of 1. If I have 2, means that these regions in some way act on the neighbor having double of the inflation. Double of the inflation means double of pressure. Double of pressure means double of strain. Anytime we have different inflation into the lung means that the forces acting regionally are different. Despite, with the ventilator, we read, let's say, 30. With this 30 is as an umbrella. Below this umbrella, regionally, I have a lot of different distribution of forces. We'll see why. And these forces produce different inflation that we may assess with the CT scan. And this, a normal lung in healthy subject, we found that the average ratio of inflation is 1.3. That means each regions on the neighbors act with this kind of multiplication. There's about 30% difference between the neighbor regions in terms of strain. But this is normal, plus minus 0.15. As this has a sort of normal distribution, if we take the double of the standard deviation, we may say the normality may be considered up 1.45, something like that, between 1 and 1.45. Okay, try to remember this number, 1.3. Then we apply force. When we apply force to the elastic structure, or when we apply force to whatever structure, the material, the molecules into the material tend to move, are in some way stretched, and developed, according to Newton, a force which is equal to the applied force, but with the opposite sign. And this force is called stress. When I'm stressed, is a way to define an internal force that disturbs my personality. In the material, the same story. And of course, the stress is equal to the force applied, according to the general laws or law of Newton. But when I apply a force, if the material is elastic, I induce a deformation. And this deformation is called strain. Okay? So, very roughly speaking, the equivalent of stress is the transpulmonary pressure. That means, when I apply a force with my respirator, 30, I have 30 euros to spend to inflate the respiratory system. I spend in part to inflate the lung, and this is called the transpulmonary pressure. But I have to spend in part to inflate the thoracic cage. And this is the pleural pressure, which moves the thoracic cage. So if I have airway pressure minus the thoracic pressure, the pleural pressure, which is measured with esophageal balloon, I have the transpulmonary pressure, which is my stress. Good. When I apply the stress, where I apply the stress? You can imagine the lung as a network of fibers. On these fibers, there are anchored with a little foot, and these foot are called, are the adhesion, not the adhesion, are the integrins, are a sort of group that anchor the cells to the extracellular matrix. What is distended is the network of elastin, collagen, and protoglycan betweens, which acts as a lubrificant. Okay? So in a very simple model, you see the spring is the elastin. Inside there is a cord, which is collagen, which is folded. When I distend, the collagen becomes linear up to its final length. At this point, you cannot more distend the lung. You reach the total lung capacity, which is the physical limit of the lung. And of course, if I continue to provide pressure, I break. I have the physical rupture. But you can imagine the cells anchored to here. The same, they have to deform their shape. They don't feel the force directly, but they have to change shape. When they change shape several times, up to a certain level, they react, producing inflammatory cytokines. The cytokines attract the white cells, and when the white cells arrive, it has to have the Wehrmacht, so it's the war, and you have the destruction, and we have full-blown inflammation. Okay? And I found these pictures which are beautiful. These are elastin fibers. And you see that the elastin is a sort of very rich network which is everywhere. And these are collagen fibers. Look, you see when they are folded at end expiration. Look now, at end inspiration, are completely stretched. So the model is not far from the reality. This is how our lung works. And of course, here are not the cells. This has been taken out. You can imagine that the cells are anchored here, the epithelial cells, and the endothelial cells. Okay, now we have stress, strain, and physics, just physics. Now we took a series of little pigs, about 30 kilos, 25, 30 kilos pigs. These pigs, on the Friday night, were taken to the city room, healthy pig, and we were measuring with the CT scan, the gas volume, the tissue volume, the sum of the characteristics at zero pressure and at 45 centimeter water pressure, which for a pig has to put about 90 centimeter water pressure in the man, because the lung characteristic of the pigs are different, is more distensible. So it reaches the same volume with less pressure. The specific elastance is lower. And we took these pigs, and we did experiments in big intensive care for nights and days. 3 nights and 2 days, or 3 days. And how these pigs were ventilated? Were ventilated with a strain. Strain was defined as the change in volume compared to the resting volume, the FRC. That means if the pig's gas volumes at 0 peak is 300, if I ventilate with 300, the strain is equal to 1. If I ventilate with 450, the strain is equal to 1.5. If I ventilate with 2, the strain, if I ventilate, the strain is 2 when I ventilate with 600. Just to give you an idea, as to take a man in anesthesia and to ventilate with 1.5 liters, strain 1, 3 liters, strain 2. So very big. Now we start to ventilate the pigs with strain around 1, and you see in black a lot of pig with an average strain up to 1.2, 1.3 didn't show any problem. After 3 days of this ventilation, you take out the lungs, are pink, gas exchange is perfect, mechanics are perfect. Which is, in healthy pig, this kind of strain, about 1.5, correspond to a ventilation of about 35 milliliters per kilo. And we know in man 12 is disaster. It's 3 times. And you say, well, these are healthy. Wait a second. It's not so simple. However, if I take a piece and I ventilate a little bit more, with a strain around 2, as to ventilate a man with 3 liters or 4 liters, not immediately, not in 5 hours, but usually after, for the first 24 hours, nothing happens. Then, suddenly, start PO2 goes down, compliance goes down. In 2 hours, you have a disaster. You have a big edema, the lung weight, which is here, becomes 3 times normal, 2 times normal. So we have a sort of threshold, below which the lung is perfectly resistant, and above which I was extremely surprised to see. I expect, well, if I ventilate with strain of 1, I will be a disaster. The first pig we did was ventilated with strain 1.5, and nothing happened. I said, my God, we worked for 30 years, we were back to all the story we did about it. So this picture, which has been reproduced with several other pigs, is quite consistent. But if you put together all this data, you see that this is the strain. 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2. And this is the stress. This stress scale is for pigs. For men, should be around the double. That means when you read 10, in the man is about 20 of transpulmonary pressure, because of the different lung characteristics, which is never written in the papers. And also the rats have completely different characteristics. So to judge the paper, you have to know a little bit of animals' physiology, which is completely ignored, usually. We translate to the man, the pig, the rats, mice, etc., etc. But what is important is the concept. You read, until this curve, the stress-strain, is linear, nothing happens. But when we start to move up, that means when, for the increasing a little bit internal volume, increase the pressure more than expected, means that some unit in this land reach their own total lung capacity. So they cannot more inflate. And this region in yellow is the region of transition up to in which some pig survive, some pig get sick. And then in this region, the mechanical ventilation is lethal. But to reach this one, in man, we have to reach a transpulmonary pressure around 20, which is never reached in clinical practice. Because if you look as an example, this from the RDS network, they found that even in the patient with a bigger lung, so the more healthy patient in this group of LDS, 6 was better than 12. And we know that in healthy animals, you say, okay, but in LDS we have a smaller lung. Well, okay, but the structure of the baby lung is normal. The specific elastance of the baby lung is normal. So there is something strange. So what's happened to reconciliate this finding? This is taken from Wikipedia, because I love Wikipedia, and I think I am one of the few that give some money. Every year I give 50 euros when they ask for money, because it's a very useful instrument. And this is a model how the forces are transmitted in an homogeneous material. I apply forces here, and apply force, and apply forces here, and you can conceptualize line of force and look out the material, which are equal. That means all the fibers take their part of work in harmony. They share the load. However, if I have an inclusion here of this shape, or even worse, of this shape, this is known in aeronautics, this is known since the first time, 3,000 years ago. If they had some line like this in the boat, they were making round to avoid the boat to crash. The same in an airplane. Because when we have an inclusion, the line, this part doesn't feel any force. The force has to concentrate in the neighbors. So locally, even if I apply 10 here, maybe here, the force is 15, or 20, or 30. How much? This was let's see what's happened here. This is the inclusion, also the shape. Did you ask yourself why in emphysema, which is some digestion, some part of the lung, the bubbles are up and not down, when the ventilation is usually down? Because the transpulmonary pressure here is greater and the forces are more concentrated. If I won't break this one and apply the forces, where will break? We break here. Because these are the line of force are concentrated. So what's about the lung? If I have an inclusion here, these lines of the ventilated lung are at risk. The ventilator-induced lung injury occurs in the part of the lung which are open to the ventilation, not to the one which are closed. Right? And PEEP, how may works? PEEP may work just keeping open this one and preventing this. This is the only mechanism for which PEEP may improve survival. And look here. These are the band of elastins, but look, the elastin covers everything. These are the alveolar space, alveolar mouth. This is a vessel. And you see there is a continuum around the vessel too. Now try to imagine I apply a force. Here is a region of dishomogeneity, because the vessel cannot expand, or at least if it can expand, it deforms, but much less than the alveoli. Though these regions of dishomogeneity act as stress risers. So they increase, they multiply the pressure applied. And this is an experiment we did. Fortunately, I think in 2 months we will have available ACT for animals. I stole from the emergency department and changed the city, and instead to destroy, we had the possibility to do experiments in the city room for 36, 70 hours. Because I'm very interested to see where the lesions start. The lesions should start in the region where the stress risers are located. And the stress risers are in the regions of dishomogeneity, around the bronchi and the vessels. And this is what's happened. You're here. You start with the lesion in these regions, and then when the lesion expands, you have an avalanche. You have the disaster. In 2 hours, the game is over. Do you remember look as an example, in the normal pulmonary edema, the Staub work, they had the peribronchial vessel and cuff, where the pressure is more negative. More negative, what means? That I have a greater pressure. It's not an image. I have a greater distension, greater pressure, which in spontaneous breathing makes more negative this area. When I apply force from external, it's the same story. You just change the sign. And this, in red, if you can read it here, are the regions that never open, even at 45 centimeters of pressure. In green, I put the regions which are more or less recruitable, so are closed at 5, but open up at 45, and in blue are the regions always open. Okay? This is the structure of an RDS line, which you may identify. Open line, openable line, and not openable line. Consolidated, recruitable, openable. This is the model of Mead. It's published in the Journal of Applied Physiology in the 70s. The young people doesn't read the literature of the 70s because it does not appear on the internet, on the PubMed. But at that time, a lot of work has been done in this. And sometimes you read now some work as new, which is 50 years old, and usually 50 years paper older, more binding computer. And Mead, what they put a model, and they build a model using different condoms at different inflation to prove it. And they say, let's say I have a complete expansion. All the fibers takes their own load, right? Now I close one. The same pressure that here was shared in all this fiber now has been concentrated in part here. These have to take more pressure. This region acted as a stress risers. And Mead calculated, if the volume of this is 10 with the gas, I degassed completely. Now the volume is 1, the ratio is 10 to 1. As the stress is expressed in the area, 10 to 1 elevated to the power of 2 terms, such a complicated passage, he found that the multiplication of the forces is about 4. That means if I apply 30, here the local force is under 20, which is a theoretical calculation. When we measure dishomogeneity, we never found a ratio 10 to 1. But part of the line may have a ratio of 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, which means maybe to multiply not by 10, but by 4, but maybe by 2. That means if you apply a normal pressure, locally you may have an extreme multiplication of the pressure. Look here. This is the average dishomogeneity, which doesn't mean much. Just tell you that more severe is the lung, mild, moderate, severe. This is the last Berlin classification. Means PO2 and FiO2 below 300, below 200, below 100. Okay? And you see, it's 1.4, 1.5, 1.7. This is the extent, how much of the lung, percent of the lung, has an abnormal dishomogeneity. 30%, 36%, 46%. It's huge. And this is the maximum, is the average in the dishomogeneous region, the intensity of dishomogeneity, which is similar. Look in severe LDS. In 46% of the lung, the pressure I applied is multiplied at about around 2, 1.6, 1%. That means if I apply 10, which is absolutely safe, locally may become close to 20, which is in the yellow regions. And this is the lung dishomogeneity as an example of the dead space. This is lung dishomogeneity measured with a CT scan. I never found any correlation with whatever variable CT scan and dead space. And this is quite good correlation for the CT scan now, which is always the variables are very straight. And the dead space means the regions in which vessels do not supply blood and are maybe more expanded. So are the regions likely to be with greater dishomogeneity. If I won't take the cluster, you see the previous relationship how present. Very, very straightforward relationship on about 130 patients with LDS. This is with a pooled inflated tissue. And this is the pooled inflated tissue in quartiles. So, if I can compute how much the pressure is multiplied. Mild, 1.4, I'm the dishomogeneities. This is the multiplication factor, 1.3. In severe as average 1.5. Here, in the severe, the multiplication factor is 2, which is the 2/3 power of the intensity. You can imagine that if I apply, let's say, 10 of transpulmonary pressure, which is easily reached with the kind of ventilation we use, about half of the lung is subject to a transpulmonary pressure not of 10, of 20. And of course, as this has quite large standard deviation, part of the lung reach easily the limits of lethal ventilation we found in normal lungs. I think the passage from normality and what we know about the LDS, the damages of the tidal volume are just linked to this kind of factors. This is the only explanation which saves everything. Just to give you, this is a moderate LDS. In these regions, we have abnormal multiplication of pressure. And you see here, which is all disease, is perfectly homogeneous. Because what is important in this homogeneous, the problem is at the interface. But look at this. My dear friends, how can we provide a safe ventilation? But even with 6 milliliters per kilo, 6 milliliters per kilo in these small lungs, very small lung, will be close to the lung capacity, plus the dishomogeneity. And for this kind of patient, which are a minority, I don't think that in normal intensive care with 6 to 10 beds, you can see more than 1, 2, 3 per year. But for this group of patients, which are the most severe, the mechanical ventilation may be lethal. Whatever form of mechanical ventilation. And so you have to think to possible alternative as the application of membrane line, maybe as a high frequency oscillation in which I do not provide tidal volume, so I do not provide energy, but just a continuous distension, which theoretically may be quite good. And this is stress versus airway pressure. And you can see that these are real patients, each line is one patient, and you see that at 30 centimeter pressure, the plateau pressure, according to the different chest wall elastors, transpulmonary pressure is important. We should measure the esophageal pressure to know what's going on in that patient. You see, a consistent number of patients in the risk zone. Now, if in this risk zone, instead of the airway pressure, you put the transpulmonary pressure that is which is multiplied locally, you can see that the risk of the picture changes completely. But I think this is the framework in which we operate. Last slide about PEEP. PEEP is a strange story. I told you in animals works beautifully. I don't have the time to give you all the reasoning behind it, but I can tell you that in a patient with LDS, during the first 2 or 3 days, looking carefully to the hemodynamics, I use a PEEP 15 or higher, because the possible risk with inappropriately high PEEP are lower than the possible risk of inappropriately lower PEEP, okay, for 2 or 3 days. But also with PEEP, look as an example in this case. This case here is homogeneous, is all close. Now I open up a lot. But look at this homogeneity. Because when I open up, the lung, which is recluded, is not perfect. Part will be more inflated, less inflated, some interstitial edema. The same tidal volume applied, the multiplication factors are far more important here. When I apply PEEP, I don't have time to show you, the dishomogeneity does not disappear, decrease a little bit, which is a good part. But in some patients may increase. And I think that the clinical results we get with PEEP, which are not straightforward, some patient goes well, but in general, with the PEEP, we don't have extraordinary effects, as with the tidal volume we had. And I think are due to the interaction of all these factors. So at the end, I will tell you what will be my dream for the safe mechanical ventilation. And I will not have the time to this. But I see a patient coming, go into the CT or an analogous to CT, and I come out in automatic probe and tell us how much is reclutable, not reclutable, and tell you how much is the dishomogeneity, and tell you also the extent and the intensity of dishomogeneity. And if we will find a threshold above which the extent of dishomogeneity is lethal, we'll tell you, okay, for this patient we will ventilate maximum with this kind of transpulmonary pressure, which corresponds to this kind of strain. In this patient, whatever transpulmonary pressure we use doesn't work. Instead of the tube, use the cannulas. That's what I'm trying to do now in some patients, at least in the lab. I thank you.